The rain hammered against the windows of the Grand Continental Hotel as Margaret Thompson adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and glanced at the ornate clock mounted above the mahogany reception desk. It was nearly 6 o'clock on a cold November evening in 1946, and the lobby buzzed with the usual mixture of traveling businessmen, well-dressed ladies clutching their purses, and the occasional family passing through the bustling downtown district. Margaret had worked as the head desk clerk for 3 years, ever since her husband Harold had returned from the Pacific Theater with a limp that ended his construction career. The job paid well enough to keep their small apartment and put food on the table, though the work often tested her patience. The hotel catered to an affluent clientele who expected nothing less than perfection, and Margaret had learned to navigate their demands with a practiced smile and unwavering professionalism. The telephone at her station rang with its familiar shrill tone, interrupting her thoughts as she organized the evening's reservation cards. She lifted the heavy black receiver to her ear, expecting another inquiry about room rates or dining reservations. Grand Continental Hotel, Margaret speaking. How may I assist you this evening? The voice on the other end was gruff, but polite, carrying the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to giving orders. Ma'am, this is Sergeant First Class Robert Chun with the Veterans Administration. I've got a group of 12 men here who need accommodation for the night. We're traveling through on official business, and our original arrangements fell through due to the weather delays. Margaret's fingers automatically moved to the reservation book, her trained eye scanning the neat columns of names and room numbers. The hotel maintained 48 rooms across 3 floors, and tonight, like most nights during the busy autumn season, they were operating at near capacity. She counted the available spaces twice to be certain. I'm terribly sorry, Sergeant Chun, she replied, her voice carrying genuine regret. We're completely full for paying guests tonight. I don't have 12 rooms available, I'm afraid. There was a pause on the line, and she could hear the muffled sound of voices in the background, the unmistakable shuffle of tired feet, and the creak of what sounded like wooden benches. Understand, ma'am. Would you happen to know of any other establishments in the area that might have space? Margaret felt a pang of sympathy as she considered the weather outside. The November storm had been raging since early afternoon, bringing with it the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones. She thought of Harold at home, probably warming himself by their small radiator and listening to the evening radio programs. The Riverside and about 6 blocks north might have availability, she offered. And there's the Traveler's Lodge on Elm Street, though I believe they may be full as well due to the storm. Many folks are staying put rather than driving in this weather. Thank you kindly, ma'am. We'll try those locations. As Margaret replaced the receiver, she noticed Mr. Pemberton, the hotel manager, emerging from his office behind the front desk. Henry Pemberton was a thin man in his 50s who wore expensive suits and maintained an air of superiority that made most of the staff uncomfortable. He had inherited the position from his father and ran the establishment with strict attention to profit margins and social status. Who was that calling? He inquired, straightening his silk tie as he approached Margaret's station. Veterans Administration, Mr. Pemberton. They were looking for rooms for a group of 12 men, but I told them we're full. Pemberton nodded approvingly. Good. We can't have just anyone staying here. Our regular clientele expects a certain atmosphere. He glanced around the lobby with satisfaction, noting the well-appointed furniture, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings that adorn the walls. The Grand Continental has a reputation to maintain. Margaret returned to her paperwork, but something about the phone call continued to trouble her. She had heard something in the sergeant's voice, a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue from travel. It reminded her of the way Harold had sounded when he first came home, carrying invisible burdens that seemed heavier than any physical weight. The lobby gradually quieted as the dinner hour approached. Most guests had either retired to their rooms or made their way to the hotel's elegant dining room, where white-clothed tables and soft piano music created an atmosphere of refined comfort. Margaret used the lull to update the guest registry and prepare for the evening shift change. At 7:30, She was surprised to see a familiar figure approaching the front desk. Dr. James Morrison was a regular guest who stayed at the hotel monthly when conducting business in the city. He was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, known for his generous tips and courteous manner toward all staff members. "Good evening, Margaret," he said warmly. "I hope you're staying dry on this dreadful night." "Good evening, Dr. Morrison." "Yes, thank you. Will you be dining in the restaurant tonight?" "Actually, I wanted to ask you about something." He leaned slightly closer, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I was at the train station earlier today, and I couldn't help but notice a group of veterans who seemed to be having difficulty finding accommodation. Young men, most of them, looking rather worse for wear. It occurred to me that they might have tried calling here." Margaret felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Yes, sir, they did call, but we're fully booked tonight." Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Well, I was wondering if you might know whether they found suitable lodging elsewhere. The weather is quite severe, and some of these men appear to be in poor health." Before Margaret could respond, Mr. Pemberton materialized beside them, having apparently overheard the conversation. "Dr. Morrison, I trust your room is satisfactory this evening?" "Quite satisfactory, thank you, Henry. I was just inquiring about some veterans who may have sought accommodation here today." Pemberton's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid we simply don't have the facilities to accommodate every transient who calls seeking rooms. The Grand Continental serves a particular clientele, as I'm sure you understand." Dr. Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly. "Transients?" "These were veterans, Henry, men who served our country." "Yes, well, service doesn't necessarily guarantee one can afford our rates," Pemberton replied stiffly. "We operate a business, not a charity." An uncomfortable silence fell over the small group. Margaret busied herself with unnecessary paperwork, while Dr. Morrison studied the manager's face with an expression that was difficult to read. "Of course," Dr. Morrison said finally. "I simply thought they might have found other arrangements." "No matter." As the doctor walked away toward the dining room, Margaret caught sight of movement outside the large front windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out shapes moving along the sidewalk, dark figures hunched against the storm. For a moment, she wondered if it might be the veterans the sergeant had mentioned, still searching for shelter in the unforgiving weather. The thought stayed with her as she continued her evening duties, a small knot of concern growing in her chest. She had seen enough hardship in her own life to recognize it in others, and the idea of men who had served their country spending a night like this without proper shelter troubled her more than she cared to admit. At 8:15, the telephone rang again. Margaret answered with her usual professional greeting, but this time the voice on the other end was different. It was still military, but younger and tinged with obvious frustration. "Ma'am, this is Corporal Davis. I'm calling on behalf of Sergeant Chun, who spoke with you earlier about accommodations for our group. We've tried every hotel and boarding house within walking distance, and everywhere is either full or," he paused, "or unwilling to accommodate us." Margaret felt her heart sink. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Corporal. The storm has certainly complicated things for everyone tonight." "Yes, ma'am. I hate to bother you again, but Sergeant Shin asked me to call back and see if perhaps any cancellations had come in or if you might have any suggestions for other options." Margaret glanced around the lobby, noting the empty chairs and the warm glow of the fireplace. At that moment, it seemed almost criminal that such comfort existed while these men faced a night in the storm. But the numbers in her reservation book remained unchanged. "I wish I could help, Corporal, but our situation hasn't changed. Have you tried the YMCA? They sometimes have dormitory-style accommodations." "We checked their first thing, ma'am. They're full up with folks displaced by the flooding on the east side of town." As Margaret searched her mind for other possibilities, she became aware that Mr. Pemberton had returned and was listening to her side of the conversation. His presence made her choose her words more carefully. "I'm afraid I can't think of anywhere else to suggest," she said reluctantly. "I'm truly sorry." After ending the call, she sat for a moment staring at the reservation book, acutely aware of Pemberton's continued presence behind her. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and she found herself thinking of Harold again, of the nights he had spent in foxholes and field hospitals, places where comfort was a luxury and survival was the only goal. "You handled that appropriately," Pemberton said, his voice carrying approval. "It's important not to make promises we can't keep or raise false hopes." Margaret nodded, though something in his tone suggested his concerns were less about the veterans' welfare and more about maintaining the hotel's policies. She turned back to her work, but the image of those shadowy figures outside the window continued to haunt her thoughts as the evening wore on. The storm intensified as the evening progressed, with wind howling around the corners of the Grand Continental Hotel and rain striking the windows with increasing violence. Margaret had completed most of her administrative duties for the shift when she noticed an unusual amount of activity in the street outside. Despite the weather, there seemed to be more pedestrians than normal, though the poor visibility made it difficult to make out details. At 9:30, she was preparing to hand over responsibilities to the night clerk when Dr. Morrison appeared at the front desk again. This time, his usually calm demeanor showed signs of agitation, and his silver hair was damp from what appeared to be a recent venture outside. "Margaret, I wonder if I might have a word with you," he said, glancing around the lobby to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "And perhaps Mr. Pemberton as well, if he's available." Something in the doctor's tone made Margaret's pulse quicken. She had known him as a guest for over 2 years, and she had never seen him anything but perfectly composed. "Of course, Dr. Morrison. Let me see if Mr. Pemberton is still in his office." She found the manager reviewing the day's receipts, his thin fingers moving efficiently through columns of figures. "Dr. Morrison would like to speak with both of us, sir." Pemberton looked up with mild irritation. "At this hour? What could be so urgent?" "I'm not certain, but he seemed quite serious about it." With obvious reluctance, Pemberton followed Margaret back to the front desk, where Dr. Morrison waited with his hands clasped behind his back. The lobby had emptied considerably, with only a few guests seated in the distant seating area, absorbed in their newspapers or quiet conversations. "Gentlemen, Margaret," Dr. Morrison began, his voice lower than usual, "I felt compelled to speak with you about the situation with those veterans I mentioned earlier." Pemberton's expression immediately grew defensive. "Dr. Morrison, I thought we had discussed this matter. Our hotel policies are quite clear, and I believe they were explained adequately." "Indeed, they were explained," the doctor replied, his tone carefully neutral. "However, I thought you should be aware of the current circumstances outside." He gestured toward the front windows, where the storm continued its relentless assault. "I took it upon myself to venture out and locate these men, wanting to ensure they had found adequate shelter for the night." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Something about the doctor's manner suggested that what he had discovered was not reassuring. "And did they find suitable accommodations?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Margaret and Pemberton. "I found them gathered under the overhang of the Old Merchants Bank building, about 4 blocks from here. 12 men, as the sergeant mentioned on the phone. They had managed to fashion a makeshift shelter using their military-issue ponchos and some cardboard they had scavenged from somewhere." The image formed in Margaret's mind, and she felt sick. The Merchants Bank had been closed for renovation for months, and its narrow overhang would provide minimal protection from the driving rain and wind. Pemberton, however, seemed unmoved. "That's unfortunate, certainly, but I don't see how it relates to hotel policy. There are social services available for such situations." "Henry," Dr. Morrison said, and something in the way he spoke the manager's name made it clear that this was not merely a casual observation. "These are not vagrants or drifters. They are United States veterans, most of them appearing to be between 20 and 25 years old. Several show obvious signs of injury or illness." Margaret's hands clenched involuntarily at her sides. She thought of Harold's sleepless nights, the way he still sometimes called out in his dreams, fighting battles that existed only in memory. I spoke briefly with their sergeant. Dr. Morrison continued. Robert Shun, I believe his name was. They are traveling from a veterans hospital in Chicago to a rehabilitation facility in Atlanta. Their transportation broke down approximately 60 miles from here, and they were forced to continue by whatever means available. The doctor paused, allowing this information to settle. Sergeant Shin informed me that several of his men are recovering from serious injuries. One young man, who couldn't have been more than 22, appeared to be suffering from some form of shell shock. Another was missing his left arm below the elbow. Margaret felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, though she struggled to maintain her professional composure. The idea of wounded veterans spending the night exposed to such weather was almost unbearable. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably, but his resolve seemed unchanged. Dr. Morrison, I understand your concern, and I don't mean to appear callous. However, the Grand Continental simply doesn't have the facilities to accommodate such a large group, especially not guests. He paused, searching for diplomatic language, who may not be able to meet our standard rates. What are your standard rates, Henry? Dr. Morrison asked quietly. Our rooms are $8 per night for single occupancy, $12 for double. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. I see. And how many rooms would be required for 12 men? Pemberton calculated quickly. Assuming double occupancy, we would need 6 rooms. However, as Margaret explained, we simply don't have 6 rooms available. Actually, Dr. Morrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a leather billfold, I took the liberty of reviewing your guest registry while waiting for you to join us. According to my count, you have exactly 6 rooms currently unoccupied. Margaret felt her confusion growing. She was certain her count had been accurate earlier in the evening. Dr. Morrison, I'm not sure I understand. When I checked the registry, we were at full capacity. The doctor smiled, though there was no warmth in it. You were quite correct in your assessment, Margaret. However, 3 guests have checked out since your conversation with the sergeant. The Weatherby party departed for an evening train. Mr. and Mrs. Constantine left due to a family emergency, and young Mr. Phillips received word that his business in the city was concluded earlier than expected. Pemberton's face flushed slightly. Even if that's correct, those rooms would need to be cleaned and prepared, and at this hour, our housekeeping staff has gone home for the evening. I see, Dr. Morrison replied. So the issue is not actually availability, but rather the inconvenience of preparing the rooms and the question of whether these men can afford your rates. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Margaret looked between the 2 men, sensing undercurrents in the conversation that she didn't fully understand. Dr. Morrison, Pemberton said, his voice taking on a colder tone, I resent the implication that this hotel discriminates against anyone for any reason other than their ability to pay for our services. We operate a business, not a charity, as I mentioned earlier. Of course, the doctor agreed. A business. Tell me, Henry, what would you say is the primary factor that allows this business to thrive in a competitive market? Pemberton looked confused by the question. Excellent service, quality accommodations, attention to detail, all admirable qualities, Dr. Morrison interrupted gently. But I would suggest that the primary factor is reputation. The Grand Continental has built its success on being known as an establishment that provides exceptional hospitality to all guests who can afford its rates. Margaret watched as the conversation continued, feeling increasingly like she was witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement about hotel policy. I'm not sure I follow your point, Pemberton said stiffly. Dr. Morrison smiled again, and this time there was something almost predatory in his expression. My point, Henry, is that reputation can be a fragile thing, particularly when it comes to matters of civic responsibility and patriotic duty. The manager's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening this establishment in some way? Not at all, the doctor replied smoothly. I'm simply observing that tomorrow morning, the story of 12 American veterans forced to spend the night in the rain while a comfortable hotel claimed to be full for paying guests could become a matter of public interest. particularly if those veterans should happen to suffer any adverse health effect from their exposure to the elements. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what was happening. Dr. Morrison was not simply advocating for the veterans. He was presenting Mr. Pemberton with a choice between accommodation and public embarrassment. Furthermore, the doctor continued, I believe it would be of interest to the general public to learn that these same veterans were told by hotel management that their military service doesn't necessarily guarantee one can afford our rates. Pemberton's face went pale. I never said that in those exact words. Perhaps not in those exact words, Dr. Morrison acknowledged. But the sentiment was quite clear, and I have an excellent memory for conversations. The lobby seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very building was holding its breath. Margaret realized that she was witnessing a confrontation that could determine not only the fate of 12 veterans on a stormy night, but potentially the future reputation of the Grand Continental Hotel. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and somewhere in the darkness, 12 men waited for shelter that seemed increasingly within reach. The silence that followed Dr. Morrison's words stretched uncomfortably through the hotel lobby. Margaret could hear the distant sound of the grandfather clock ticking near the elevator, each second seeming to echo the gravity of the moment. Mr. Pemberton stood frozen, his thin frame rigid with what appeared to be a mixture of anger and calculation. Dr. Morrison, Pemberton finally said, his voice carefully controlled, I believe you may be misunderstanding our position. The Grand Continental has always been supportive of our nation's veterans. However, we must also maintain our standards and consider the comfort of our regular guests. The doctor nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this response. Of course, Henry. And I'm certain that your regular guests will be greatly comforted to know that their hotel management prioritizes their convenience over the welfare of men who risked their lives for this country. Margaret watched as Pemberton's jaw clenched visibly. She had never seen her manager in such a position, caught between his business instincts and the growing weight of moral pressure. Moreover, Dr. Morrison continued, I suspect that many of your regular guests will be quite interested to learn about tonight's events. Mr. Crawford from Crawford Steel, for instance. I believe he mentioned losing his youngest son at Normandy when we spoke last month. The color drained from Pemberton's face completely. Thomas Crawford was one of the hotel's most valuable clients, hosting monthly business dinners and maintaining a standing reservation for out-of-town associates. His company had recently expanded significantly with post-war construction contracts, making him even more important to the hotel's financial success. Or perhaps Mrs. Wellington might have thoughts on the matter, Dr. Morrison added almost casually. I recall her mentioning that her nephew was among the men who liberated the prison camps in Germany. She seemed quite passionate about honoring the service of our veterans. Margaret realized that Dr. Morrison was not merely threatening negative publicity. He was specifically targeting the hotel's most influential and wealthy patrons, people whose opinions could make or break the establishment's reputation in the community. Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. Dr. Morrison, I think perhaps we should discuss this matter privately in my office. I don't think that will be necessary, the doctor replied. This is quite simple, really. You have 6 available rooms, 12 men in need of shelter, and the financial means to resolve the situation. The only question remaining is whether you choose to act as a responsible member of this community or... He left the sentence hanging. At that moment, Margaret felt compelled to speak, despite her usual reluctance to involve herself in management decisions. Mr. Pemberton, if I may say something? Both men turned to her, and she felt her cheeks flush under their attention. I've been thinking about those rooms that became available this evening. If we're willing to put them back into service, I could stay late to help prepare them. My Herald wouldn't mind, especially knowing it's for veterans. Pemberton looked at her with surprise, as if he had forgotten she was present during the conversation. Margaret, that's not necessary. This is a management decision, not something for the staff to worry about. With respect, sir, she continued, emboldened by Dr. Morrison's encouraging nod. I think it is something for all of us to worry about. These men served our country, and they're in trouble. If we can help them, shouldn't we? The manager's expression softened slightly at her words, though his resolve still appeared uncertain. The question remains about payment. Hotel policy requires advance payment or adequate assurance of payment for all guests. Dr. Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his billfold once again. How much would be required for 6 rooms for one night? Pemberton calculated quickly. At double occupancy rates, that would be $72. Without hesitation, Dr. Morrison counted out bills from his wallet, placing them carefully on the marble surface of the reception desk. There, payment in advance for their accommodations. Margaret felt her eyes widen at the sight of the money. $72 represented more than 3 weeks of her salary, yet the doctor had produced it without any apparent strain. Dr. Morrison, Pemberton said weakly, "This is quite generous, but I'm not sure it's appropriate for you to—" "Henry," the doctor interrupted, "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm offering to pay for these rooms as a guest of this hotel. Whether you choose to accept that payment and provide the accommodations is entirely up to you." The manager stared at the money for a long moment, and Margaret could almost see his internal struggle. The practical businessman in him recognized that refusing cash payment would be nearly impossible to justify, while his pride balked at being maneuvered into a decision he hadn't made willingly. "There's another consideration," Dr. Morrison added quietly. "I happen to know that tomorrow's morning edition of the Tribune will include a feature article about local veterans affairs. The reporter, Miss Catherine O'Brien, has been quite thorough in her research. I suspect she would be very interested in any developments related to veterans' treatment in our community." This final revelation seemed to tip the scales. Margaret watched as Pemberton's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight going out of him as he realized the full scope of the situation he faced. "Very well," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, please call the housekeeping supervisor home and ask her to arrange for the rooms to be prepared immediately. And telephone Sergeant Chun to inform him that we have accommodations available." Margaret felt a surge of relief, so strong it nearly made her dizzy. "Yes, sir. Right away." As she reached for the telephone, Dr. Morrison placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Actually, Margaret, I think it might be more appropriate if I personally went to inform the sergeant. These men have had a difficult enough evening without receiving another impersonal telephone call." Margaret nodded, understanding that the doctor wanted to ensure the veterans knew their accommodation had been secured through good, well, rather than mere business transaction. "I'll accompany you," Pemberton said suddenly, surprising both of them. "If these gentlemen are to be guests of the Grand Continental, they should be properly welcomed." Dr. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "That's quite thoughtful, Henry. I'm sure they'll appreciate the gesture." As the 2 men prepared to leave, Margaret busied herself with the necessary telephone calls. She first contacted Mrs. Rodriguez, the housekeeping supervisor, explaining the situation and requesting immediate preparation of 6 double occupancy rooms. To her credit, Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to return to the hotel immediately, bringing 2 of her most reliable staff members. Next, she began preparing registration cards for the veterans, though she realized she would need their names and information when they arrived. The simple act of creating these documents felt significant somehow, transforming abstract figures in a story into real guests who would soon be walking through the hotel's front doors. As she worked, Margaret found herself thinking about Harold and the stories he had shared about his time in the Pacific. He rarely spoke about the combat itself, but he had often mentioned the kindness of strangers during his journey home, people who had offered rides, meals, or simply words of encouragement to soldiers in transition. Through the front windows, she could see Dr. Morrison and Mr. Pemberton making their way down the street, hunched against the continuing storm. The sight of the hotel manager venturing out into the weather to personally escort the veterans back to shelter seemed almost surreal, given his attitude just an hour earlier. Margaret realized that she was witnessing something more than just a business decision or even an act of charity. She was seeing how quickly circumstances could change when someone was willing to stand up for what was right, and how even the most resistant hearts could be moved when presented with the proper combination of pressure and opportunity. The thought occurred to her that tomorrow, when the veterans had continued their journey and the storm had passed, this night would become a story told and retold in the hotel. She hoped it would be remembered as the night the Grand Continental chose to live up to the highest ideals of hospitality, rather than the night they nearly failed to do so. As she finished her preparations and waited for the men to return, Margaret felt a profound sense of satisfaction. For once, she had been part of something larger than daily routine, something that would make Harold proud when she told him about it over breakfast the next morning. 20 minutes later, Margaret heard voices approaching through the storm, and she looked up from her paperwork to see the front doors of the Grand Continental Hotel opening to admit a sight that would remain etched in her memory for the rest of her life. Dr. Morrison entered first, shaking rainwater from his coat, followed by Mr. Pemberton, who appeared thoroughly soaked despite the brief journey. Behind them came the veterans, and Margaret felt her heart tighten at their appearance. Sergeant First Class Robert Chun led the group, a compact man of medium height with intelligent dark eyes and posture that spoke of military discipline despite obvious fatigue. His uniform, while clean, showed signs of wear and multiple repairs. As he removed his service cap, Margaret could see premature gray at his temples, though he appeared to be no more than 30 years old. The 11 men who followed him varied in age from what looked like barely 18 to perhaps 25, but all carried themselves with a particular combination of alertness and weariness that Margaret had learned to recognize in Harold and his veteran friends. Several limped noticeably. One young man kept his left arm tucked close to his body in a way that suggested injury, and another's hands trembled slightly as he struggled to remove his soaked jacket. What struck Margaret most powerfully was not their obvious exhaustion or their bedraggled appearance, but the dignity they maintained despite their circumstances. These were not men seeking charity or pity. They were soldiers who had found themselves in difficult circumstances and were grateful for assistance while maintaining their self-respect. Sergeant Chun, Dr. Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the lobby, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Thompson, our head desk clerk, and Mr. Henry Pemberton, the hotel manager." Sergeant Chin stepped forward and offered a precise salute to both Margaret and Pemberton. "Ma'am, sir, I want to thank you for your generosity tonight. My men and are grateful for your kindness." Margaret felt tears threatening again at the simple dignity of the gesture. "You're very welcome, Sergeant. We're honored to have you stay with us." Mr. Pemberton, still dripping from their journey through the storm, stepped forward with an expression Margaret had never seen on his face before. The usual calculation and business-focused demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Sergeant Chun, gentlemen," he began, his voice more formal than usual, "I want to apologize for the delay in arranging your accommodations. The Grand Continental Hotel is proud to serve those who have served our country." Margaret noticed that several of the younger veterans exchanged glances at this formal welcome, and she suspected they had not expected such treatment after their earlier difficulties finding shelter. "If I may," Sergeant Chin replied, "I'd like to introduce my men." He turned to the group behind him, and despite their obvious exhaustion, they automatically arranged themselves into a loose formation. "This is Corporal James Davis, who spoke with you on the telephone earlier." A young African-American man stepped forward slightly, nodding respectfully to Margaret. She remembered his voice from the second phone call, and she was struck by how much younger he appeared than he had sounded. "Private First Class Michael O'Sullivan," the sergeant continued, indicating a red-haired young man whose left sleeve was pinned up where his arm should have been. Margaret had to steel herself to keep her expression neutral, thinking of Dr. Morrison's earlier description. "Private Tommy Kowalski," Chun continued, gesturing to a slight young man who appeared to be no more than 19 and whose eyes held a distant quality that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of Harold during his difficult early days home from the war. As the sergeant continued the introductions, Margaret began preparing registration cards, taking down names and information with practiced efficiency. She learned that the group included men from across the country: Massachusetts, Iowa, Texas, California, and places she had never heard of. They had served in different units, different theaters of the war, but had been brought together by injury or illness that required extended treatment and rehabilitation. Private Antonio Restrepo from Arizona had been wounded in Italy and still walked with a pronounced limp. Corporal William Murphy from Boston had been aboard a ship that was torpedoed in the Atlantic and still suffered from what he quietly described as nervous troubles. Private First Class David Kim from California had been captured during the retreat from Seoul and bore the physical and mental scars of months in a prisoner of war camp. Each man, as his name was called, stepped forward with military bearing and acknowledged the introductions with quiet dignity. Margaret found herself thinking that any one of their stories could fill a book, yet here they were, simply grateful for a dry room and a warm bed for the night. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived during the introductions, accompanied by 2 housekeeping staff members who immediately set to work preparing the designated rooms on the second floor. Margaret could hear their efficient movement overhead as they changed linens, cleaned bathrooms, and ensured that each room was properly prepared for occupancy. "Gentlemen," Mr. Pemberton announced once the introductions were complete, "your rooms will be ready shortly. In the meantime, I've arranged for coffee and sandwiches to be prepared in our dining room. Please, make yourselves comfortable." Margaret watched with amazement as her manager, who had been so resistant to accommodating these men just an hour earlier, now personally escorted them toward the hotel's dining area. Dr. Morrison caught her eye and offered a subtle wink, acknowledging the transformation they had witnessed together. As the veterans filed past her desk, several stopped to offer individual thanks. Corporal Davis paused to say, "Ma'am, I hope you know how much this means to us. We've been traveling for 3 days since our truck broke down, and we haven't had a proper roof over our heads since we left Chicago." Private O'Sullivan, adjusting his pinned sleeves self-consciously, added, "Most places wouldn't even talk to us once they saw how we looked. Thank you for treating us like human beings." Margaret felt her throat tighten at these words. "It's our honor to have you here," she managed to say. "Please, let us know if there's anything else you need." As the last of the veterans disappeared into the dining room, Dr. Morrison approached her desk once more. "Margaret, I want you to know that your willingness to stay late and help prepare those rooms was the deciding factor in this situation. Mr. Pemberton needed to see that his own staff believed it was the right thing to do." Margaret felt herself blushing at the praise. "It just seemed like the obvious thing to do, Dr. Morrison. I keep thinking about my Harold, about what it was like for him when he was trying to get home after the war ended." The doctor nodded, understanding. "These men have given more than most people can imagine. The least we can do is ensure they have shelter when they need it." Over the next hour, Margaret completed the check-in procedures for all 12 veterans, ensuring that each room assignment was properly recorded and that wake-up calls were arranged for their early morning departure. Mrs. Rodriguez reported that all rooms were ready and that she had provided extra blankets and pillows, knowing that many veterans struggle with temperature regulation due to their injuries or conditions. As the veterans finally made their way upstairs to their rooms, Margaret noticed that several of them walked more easily than they had upon arrival. The simple knowledge that they had secure shelter for the night seemed to have lifted some invisible burden from their shoulders. Sergeant Chun was the last to check in, and as he signed the registration card, he looked up at Margaret with sincere gratitude. "Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 12 years, and I've seen how people treat soldiers in all kinds of circumstances. What happened here tonight gives me hope that maybe this country remembers what we fought for." Margaret felt the full weight of the evening settling on her shoulders as she watched the sergeant climb the stairs to join his men. Through the front windows, the storm continued to rage, but inside the Grand Continental Hotel, 12 American veterans were settling into comfortable beds, safe and warm for the first time in days. As she prepared to turn over the desk to the night clerk, Margaret realized that this evening had changed something fundamental in her understanding of what hospitality truly meant. It was not simply about providing service to those who could afford it, but about recognizing the humanity and dignity of every person who sought shelter and assistance. The night clerk, Mr. Patterson, arrived promptly at 11 o'clock, and Margaret briefed him on the situation with her special guests. She emphasized that the veterans would be departing early in the morning and that they should receive any assistance they needed without question. As she gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave for home, Margaret took one final look around the hotel lobby. Tomorrow, it would return to its normal routine of serving businessmen and wealthy travelers, but tonight it had served a higher purpose. Tonight, the Grand Continental Hotel had truly lived up to its name, providing grand and continental hospitality to those who needed it most. Margaret arrived at the Grand Continental Hotel the following morning 30 minutes earlier than usual, her curiosity about the veterans' departure overriding her normal routine. The storm had finally passed during the night, leaving behind clear skies and the crisp, clean air that often follows severe weather. As she entered through the staff entrance, she could hear voices from the main lobby, and she quickened her pace to see what was happening. What she discovered surprised her more than anything that had occurred the previous evening. The lobby had been transformed into an informal gathering place. Several regular hotel guests were engaged in animated conversation with the veterans, who appeared refreshed and considerably more presentable after a night of proper rest. Mr. Crawford from Crawford Steel sat in one of the leather armchairs, deep in discussion with Sergeant Chun and Corporal Davis. Mrs. Wellington occupied the settee near the fireplace, surrounded by three of the younger veterans who appeared to be listening intently to something she was saying. Dr. Morrison stood near the front desk, observing the scene with obvious satisfaction. When he noticed Margaret's arrival, he approached her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Margaret. I trust you slept well after yesterday's excitement." "Good morning, Dr. Morrison. I did, thank you. But I'm surprised to see so many people up and about so early. What's happening here?" The doctor's smile widened. "Word has a way of traveling quickly in a small community. Several of our regular guests learned about our special visitors and wanted to meet them before their departure." Margaret looked around the lobby with amazement. She had never seen such informal socializing among the hotel's typically reserved clientele. "How did they find out?" "Mr. Pemberton apparently made some telephone calls last evening after you left. It seems he wanted to ensure that our treatment of these veterans reflected well on the hotel's reputation. He contacted several of our most prominent guests to inform them of the establishment's patriotic gesture." Margaret felt a mixture of admiration and amusement at this revelation. Even in his moment of moral awakening, Pemberton had found a way to turn the situation to the hotel's advantage. And they came down to meet the veterans? "More than that," Dr. Morrison replied. "Mr. Crawford has offered employment opportunities to any of the men who might be interested in settling in this area after their rehabilitation. Mrs. Wellington has arranged for her church to provide a substantial donation to the Veterans Facility in Atlanta. And Judge Harrison, who arrived about 20 minutes ago, is helping several of the men understand their benefits and legal rights." Margaret shook her head in wonder. "This is extraordinary. Yesterday evening we could barely find them rooms, and now they're being treated as honored guests and valued members of the community," Dr. Morrison finished. "It's remarkable how quickly attitudes can change when people are given the opportunity to do the right thing." As Margaret took her position behind the front desk, she could hear fragments of the various conversations taking place throughout the lobby. Mr. Crawford was explaining to Sergeant Chun about the growing construction business in the area and the need for experienced supervisors who understood discipline and organization. Mrs. Wellington was telling Private Kowalski about her nephew's successful transition to civilian life and the importance of staying connected with fellow veterans. Judge Harrison, a distinguished elderly gentleman who had served on the state Supreme Court before retiring, was carefully reviewing documents with Private First Class Kim, explaining various veterans programs and benefits that might be available to him. Margaret realized that what she was witnessing was not simply kindness or charity, but genuine community engagement. These prominent citizens were not merely offering token assistance. They were making real connections and providing tangible help that could change the course of these men's lives. At 7:30, Mr. Pemberton emerged from his office, impeccably dressed as always, but with an expression that seemed more relaxed than Margaret had ever seen. He surveyed the lobby scene with obvious pride, and she realized that his perspective on the previous evening's events had evolved considerably. "Good morning, Margaret," he said as he approached her station. "I trust everything is proceeding smoothly with our guest departure arrangements?" "Yes, sir." Sergeant Shin mentioned that their transportation should arrive around 8 o'clock. "I prepare their bills, though Dr. Morrison has already settled all charges." Pemberton nodded approvingly. "Excellent. I want to ensure that their final impression of the Grand Continental is entirely positive." Margaret looked at her manager with new eyes. "Mr. Pemberton, if you don't mind my asking, what made you decide to contact the other guests about the veterans?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Initially, I thought it would be wise to manage the story, to ensure that any account of last evening's events reflected well on the hotel. But as I made those calls, I realized that I was genuinely proud of what we had done. These men deserved better than just a grudging accommodation. They deserved to be welcomed properly." At that moment, Sergeant Chun approached the front desk, followed by several of his men. Their appearance was strikingly different from the previous evening. Rested, clean, and properly groomed, they looked every inch the professional soldiers they were, despite their various injuries and the civilian clothes most now wore. "Ma'am, sir," the sergeant addressed Margaret and Pemberton, "my men, and I wanted to thank you once more before our departure. Last night was the best rest we've had in weeks, and the kindness shown to us this morning has been overwhelming." Private O'Sullivan stepped forward, still self-conscious about his pinned sleeve, but standing straighter than he had the evening before. "Mr. Pemberton, sir, I wanted you to know that Mr. Crawford has offered me a position with his company once I complete my rehabilitation. He says there's always need for men who understand hard work and dedication." Margaret felt her eyes filling with tears at the young man's obvious joy and hope. Corporal Davis added, "Judge Harrison helped me understand some benefits I didn't even know I was entitled to. He's given me the name of someone in Atlanta who can help me and the other men navigate the system properly." Mr. Pemberton accepted these thanks with uncharacteristic humility. "Gentlemen, you served our country with honor. The least we could do was serve you with the same honor you deserve." At 8 o'clock precisely, a large bus pulled up in front of the hotel, and Margaret could see through the windows that it was filled with additional veterans. Their driver, a cheerful man in his 40s who introduced himself as Frank Peterson, explained that he had been hired by the Veterans Administration to transport groups between facilities, and he had been delayed by the previous night's storm. As the 12 veterans prepared to board the bus, an impromptu farewell ceremony developed in the hotel lobby. Mr. Crawford shook hands with each man and pressed business cards in his several palms. Mrs. Wellington embraced them with motherly affection, pressing small packages of food into their hands for the journey. Judge Harrison distributed copies of information about veterans' rights and benefits, along with his personal contact information. Dr. Morrison stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. When Sergeant Chun approached him for a final farewell, the doctor grasped the younger man's hand firmly. "Sergeant, I want you to know that meeting you and your men has been an honor for all of us. You've reminded us of what true service and sacrifice look like." "Dr. Morrison," the sergeant replied, "you turned what could have been one of the worst nights of our journey into one of the best. We won't forget the kindness we've been shown here." As the veterans filed out of the hotel toward their waiting bus, Margaret noticed that several other guests had gathered near the windows to watch their departure. The entire hotel seemed to have been affected by their brief presence. Private Kowalski was the last to leave, and as he passed Margaret's desk, he stopped and offered her a small, hand-carved wooden figure. "My grandfather taught me woodworking before the war," he said quietly. "I made this for you last night before I fell asleep. Thank you for treating us like we mattered." Margaret accepted the gift with trembling hands. It was a beautifully crafted eagle, no larger than her palm, with intricate detail work that spoke of considerable skill and time investment. "Thank you," she whispered. "This is beautiful, and you do matter. You all matter very much. As the bus pulled away from the Grand Continental Hotel, Margaret stood at the front window watching until it disappeared around the corner. The lobby gradually returned to its normal quiet elegance, but something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere of the place. Dr. Morrison approached her one final time before returning to his room. "Margaret, I hope you realize that what happened here yesterday and today started with your simple act of human kindness. When you offered to stay late to prepare those rooms, you reminded all of us of our better angels." Margaret looked down at the wooden eagle in her hands, then around at the lobby that had witnessed such an extraordinary transformation. "Dr. Morrison, I think those veterans reminded us of something we had forgotten about hospitality. It's not just about serving people who can afford our services. It's about recognizing the dignity and worth of every person who seeks shelter and assistance." That evening, as Margaret prepared to leave for home, she found an envelope on her desk with her name written in Mr. Pemberton's precise handwriting. Inside was a brief note and a check for $50, a sum equal to more than 2 weeks of her salary. The note read, "Margaret, your willingness to extend yourself for others represents the finest traditions of hospitality. Your example inspired all of us to be better than we were. Thank you for reminding us what the Grand Continental Hotel should truly represent." As Margaret walked home through the clear evening air, she reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. 12 strangers had arrived seeking shelter and had left as honored guests, their lives potentially changed by the connections they had made. More importantly, perhaps, the hotel itself had been transformed from a place that merely provided expensive accommodations to one that exemplified the highest ideals of American hospitality. She thought of Harold waiting for her at home, eager to hear about her day. Tonight, she would have quite a story to tell him about how a simple phone call requesting rooms had led to one of the most extraordinary experiences of her life. She would tell him about veterans who maintained their dignity in the face of hardship, about wealthy citizens who opened their hearts along with their wallets, and about how sometimes doing the right thing requires courage but leads to outcomes more rewarding than anyone could have imagined. As she climbed the steps to her apartment building, Margaret looked once more at the wooden eagle in her hand. Tomorrow, she would place it in a position of honor on her desk at the Grand Continental Hotel, where it would serve as a permanent reminder that true hospitality means opening doors not just to those who can afford to enter, but to those who need shelter from life's storms. The story of that November night would become part of the hotel's lore, told and retold to new staff members and shared with guests who became part of the Grand Continental family. It became a reminder that sometimes the most important guests are not those who arrive in expensive cars, but those who arrive in need of simple human kindness and respect. And in Atlanta, 12 veterans would continue their journeys toward healing and new lives, carrying with them the knowledge that somewhere in America, there were people who recognized their worth and honored their service not with empty words, but with genuine hospitality and practical assistance. For some, that knowledge would make all the difference in the world.